History has a strange habit of focusing our attention on the loudest and most theatrical villains, while completely ignoring the quiet bureaucrats who actually turned those deranged political fantasies into a functioning reality. We are naturally drawn to the screaming dictators and the terrifying military commanders covered in medals because they look exactly like the monsters we have been taught to fear since childhood. But the most dangerous men in the Third Reich rarely ever raised their voices or fired a weapon. The man we are looking at today possessed a completely ordinary face that you would instantly forget if you passed him on the street. Yet, he was directly responsible for designing the most efficient and ruthless mobile killing machinery the world has ever seen. His name was Bruno Streckenbach, and while you will rarely find his name in the standard high school history books, he is the dark architect who took the scattered, chaotic hatred of the Nazi regime and organized it into the devastatingly precise death squads known as the Einsatzgruppen. To truly understand how a seemingly normal person evolves into an administrator of mass death, we have to look back at the shattered society of Germany immediately following the end of the First World War. The country was completely humiliated, economically ruined, and violently divided, creating an environment where a young, highly intelligent man like Streckenbach found himself drawn not to building a peaceful future, but to the bitter, bloody street fighting of the Weimar Republic. He joined the Freikorps, which were essentially rogue paramilitary groups of angry veterans, and he quickly discovered that he possessed a very unique, highly effective combination of absolute ruthlessness on the streets and a remarkably cold, calculating analytical mind in the office. He didn't just want to fight in the alleys because he realized very early on that unorganized violence achieves nothing, and he began to see that true power lies in the ability to organize, categorize, and systematically eliminate your enemies with bureaucratic precision. This terrifying talent for combining street-level brutality with corporate-level efficiency made him an incredibly valuable asset when the newly formed Gestapo started looking for men to crush the communist opposition in the major port city of Hamburg. When Streckenbach took charge of the local political police, he didn't rely on chaotic raids or random terror, but instead he built an incredibly meticulous filing system, turning the act of political suppression into a smooth, running assembly line. He mapped out the entire opposition network, identified the key leaders with chilling accuracy, and systematically dismantled the resistance until the city of Hamburg was completely under the iron grip of the secret police. This flawless performance immediately caught the attention of Reinhard Heydrich, the infamous chief of the Reich Main Security Office, who was actively searching for highly capable, emotionless men who could help him expand his empire of terror across the entire European continent. Heydrich recognized a kindred spirit in Streckenbach, seeing a man who viewed human beings not as living, breathing individuals with families and hopes, but simply as logistical problems that needed to be solved and erased on paper. He quickly promoted Streckenbach and brought him to Berlin, placing him in a position of immense, unseen power by making him the head of the personnel department for the entire security apparatus of the Third Reich. It is deeply unsettling to realize that from this comfortable office in the capital, Streckenbach was essentially acting as the ultimate human resources manager from hell, carefully selecting the exact men who would soon be sent out to drown Europe in unimaginable tragedy. He specifically looked for educated, highly organized individuals, intentionally recruiting lawyers, doctors, economists, and even former ministers, because he fundamentally believed that mass extermination required intelligent management rather than just mindless savagery. When the German military machine violently crossed the border into Poland in the autumn of 1939, Streckenbach was given his first major opportunity to test his terrifying theories on population control on a massive, countrywide scale. He was one of the primary organizers of the devastating Operation Tannenberg, which was a deeply cynical and highly classified campaign designed to completely decapitate Polish society by hunting down their teachers, priests, intellectuals, and political leaders. He sent his specialized task forces behind the advancing army with detailed lists of names and addresses, systematically removing anyone who possessed the education or influence to potentially organize a resistance movement against the German occupation. However, during this brutal campaign in Poland, Streckenbach made a crucial, chilling observation that would forever alter the course of the war and lead to the darkest chapter in modern human history. He noticed that the regular army soldiers and the initial police battalions were struggling psychologically with the intimate, horrific reality of executing unarmed civilians, women, and children day after day in the forests and ravines of Eastern Europe. Streckenbach analyzed this psychological breakdown not as a moral failing or a human tragedy, but purely as a logistical inefficiency that needed to be corrected before the Nazi regime embarked on its ultimate ideological crusade. This brings us to the fateful spring of 1941, when Adolf Hitler made the disastrous decision to break the non-aggression pact and launch a catastrophic invasion of the Soviet Union, demanding a war of absolute annihilation that ignored all conventional rules of military engagement. Reinhard Heydrich summoned Streckenbach and tasked him with what seemed like an impossible administrative nightmare, ordering him to create a highly mobile, heavily armed extermination force that could follow the army into Russia and instantly liquidate entire communities. Streckenbach didn't hesitate or question the devastating morale weight of this order, instead retreating to his office to systematically design the architecture of the Einsatzgruppen, carefully calculating everything from the amount of ammunition required to the fuel needed for their transport trucks. He gathered approximately 3,000 carefully chosen men in a quiet, unassuming German training town called Pretsch, far away from the prying eyes of the public, where he personally oversaw their preparation for the apocalyptic mission ahead. It is a profoundly disturbing thought that in this peaceful little town, Streckenbach stood before a crowd of highly educated professionals and calmly, clearly instructed them that their sole duty was to step onto Soviet soil and systematically murder millions of innocent Jewish families, communist officials, and local partisans. He organized these men into 4 incredibly lethal, highly mobile death squads, ensuring that they were perfectly integrated into the logistical supply lines of the regular German army, so their grim work would never be delayed by a lack of resources. The terrifying reality of Streckenbach's meticulous planning became agonizingly clear the moment the invasion began, as his Einsatzgruppen swept across Eastern Europe, leaving a trail of absolute devastation and shattered communities in their wake. Because of the flawless administrative framework he had designed in Berlin, these 4 relatively small units managed to murder well over 1 million men, women, and children in just the first few agonizing months of the Soviet campaign. History often struggles to comprehend the sheer scale of this tragedy, but it is vital to remember that every single bullet fired in those dark forests was paid for, tracked, and organized by a quiet man sitting behind a polished wooden desk hundreds of miles away. He had successfully proven to the highest levels of the Nazi leadership that industrial-scale genocide was entirely possible, ultimately laying the organizational groundwork for the horrific extermination camps that would soon follow. However, life inside the upper echelons of the Nazi security apparatus was a vicious, highly paranoid game of survival, and Streckenbach soon found that his powerful position was not nearly as secure as he had confidently believed. When his protector Reinhard Heydrich was assassinated by heroic Czech commandos on the streets of Prague in 1942, Streckenbach suddenly lost his political shield and found himself completely exposed to the toxic rivalries tearing through the secret police headquarters. The new chief of the security service, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, was an insecure, deeply paranoid bureaucrat who heavily resented Streckenbach's immense influence and actively maneuvered to strip him of his power and push him out of the organization. Facing the complete destruction of his carefully built career, Streckenbach made a deeply surprising decision that shocked his rivals, formally requesting to be transferred out of the comfortable offices of Berlin and directly into the brutal, freezing meat grinder of the Waffen-SS on the Eastern Front. It is incredibly rare for a career desk murderer to willingly trade his tailored uniform for the mud and blood of actual combat, but Streckenbach proved to be highly adaptable, taking command of the 8th SS Cavalry Division Florian Geyer, despite having almost no frontline tactical experience. He applied the exact same cold, analytical ruthlessness to military command that he had previously applied to human extermination, fighting his way through the collapsing front lines with a terrifying calmness that somehow earned him the highest military decorations from the crumbling regime. As the war rapidly turned into an apocalyptic nightmare for the German forces, he was given command of the 19th Waffen Grenadier Division, a unit composed largely of Latvian conscripts who were fighting a desperate, losing battle against the overwhelming might of the advancing Red Army. Streckenbach ultimately led these exhausted, freezing men into the Courland Pocket, a massive and hopeless entrapment on the Baltic coast where they were completely surrounded and cut off from the rest of the retreating German military. He held his ground in that frozen pocket of hell until the very last days of the war, fighting with the frantic, desperate energy of a man who knew exactly what kind of vengeance the Soviets would unleash upon him if they ever discovered his true identity. When Nazi Germany finally surrendered in the spring of 1945, the architect of the death squads found himself trapped, exhausted, and swept up by the victorious Red Army alongside thousands of his starving Latvian soldiers, marking the definitive end of his violent military career. He was immediately transported under heavy guard to the notorious Lubyanka prison in Moscow, a place perfectly designed to break the human spirit, where Soviet interrogators eventually pieced together the horrifying truth that they were holding the man who had directly engineered the slaughter of their people. Logic strongly dictates that the notoriously brutal Soviet justice system should have immediately dragged him into a dark basement and executed him without a second thought. But history is rarely that straightforward, and for deeply complex political reasons, they decided to keep him alive. Instead of facing the firing squad he so richly deserved, Streckenbach was put through the grueling Soviet legal system and ultimately sentenced to 25 years of backbreaking hard labor in the freezing, unforgiving environment of the Siberian Gulag. Spending a decade starving and freezing in a Soviet labor camp is undeniably a terrible fate for any human being. But when you weigh his suffering against the millions of innocent families whose lives were violently erased because of his paperwork, his punishment feels like a deeply frustrating insult to justice. For 10 long, silent years, the man who meticulously calculated the logistics of the Holocaust faded into the snowy obscurity of the Soviet prison system, and most people naturally assumed he would eventually die there, completely forgotten by a world that was desperately trying to heal and move on. But geopolitical landscapes shift in strange and unpredictable ways, and in 1955, the West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer traveled to Moscow and successfully negotiated a massive diplomatic agreement to bring the last remaining German prisoners of war back to their homeland. Bruno Streckenbach, the very man who had built the mobile killing machinery of the Third Reich, was quietly placed on a train heading west, eventually stepping back onto German soil as a free man, casually re-entering a society that was rapidly trying to rebuild and forget its dark past. You would reasonably expect that the newly established democratic West German government would be waiting at the border to immediately arrest him and put him on trial for his undeniable, highly documented crimes against humanity. But the post-war German justice system was tragically flawed and heavily populated by former Nazi officials who were perfectly willing to look the other way, allowing men like Streckenbach to slip quietly back into normal civilian life without facing a single consequence. He didn't have to flee to the jungles of South America or spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder under an assumed identity. He simply returned to his hometown of Hamburg, bought a nice suit, and secured a very comfortable, ordinary job as a manager in a shoe manufacturing company. It is absolutely sickening to imagine that the man who ordered the executions of thousands of children spent the 1950s and 1960s living a peaceful, prosperous life, drinking coffee in sunny cafes and walking through beautiful parks alongside the very society he had once helped to terrorize. He blended perfectly into the economic miracle of post-war Germany, hiding his monstrous past behind the gentle, aging face of a respectable businessman, proving that the most successful architects of evil are the ones who know exactly how to look completely ordinary. It wasn't until the late 1960s, a full 2 decades after the guns of the Second World War had finally fallen silent, that a new generation of German prosecutors finally found the political courage and the legal evidence necessary to officially indict him for his massive, unforgivable crimes. They meticulously built a massive legal case against him, fully intending to expose the quiet shoe company manager to the world and deliver the long overdue justice that millions of victims and their shattered families rightfully deserved. But Bruno Streckenbach, a man who had successfully manipulated his way through Weimar street brawls, Gestapo politics, the freezing Eastern Front, and the Soviet Gulag, still had one final, deeply infuriating trick up his sleeve to play against the justice system. When the trial was finally set to begin, his team of defense lawyers produced a massive stack of complex medical documents signed by sympathetic doctors, aggressively claiming that Streckenbach suffered from a severe, life-threatening heart condition and was simply too fragile to withstand the stress of a courtroom. He played the role of the frail, deteriorating old man with absolute, chilling perfection, manipulating the emotional empathy of the legal system with the exact same cold calculation he had once used to organize the mobile killing squads. The German courts, perhaps lacking the energy and the stomach for another highly publicized, emotionally exhausting Nazi trial, completely accepted the medical deception and officially suspended the proceedings indefinitely, declaring that it would be inhumane to prosecute a dying man. Because of this final, masterful manipulation of the truth, the architect of the Einsatzgruppen was allowed to return to his comfortable home in Hamburg, entirely untouched by the justice system he had so easily outsmarted. He didn't die quickly, as his doctors had warned. Instead, he lived for several more comfortable years in total peace, enjoying a quiet retirement that he had permanently stolen from millions of innocent people across the European continent. When Bruno Streckenbach finally took his last breath in the autumn of 1977 at the age of 75, he died peacefully in his own warm bed, a deeply chilling reminder that sometimes the true architects of hell never actually face justice on earth, leaving us to grapple with a dark, haunting history that refuses to be forgotten.